This is a review of the 1962 Brian Forbes movie, The L-Shaped Room. And let me just say, this is a great movie that I think you might really like and you should probably watch. This just barely squeaks into this series of sort of underrated movies, not because it's not underrated, it definitely is, but because it is somewhat well known. There's been a 4K remaster of this movie, for instance. I'm not the only person who thinks it's pretty cool. It's got 1.8K votes on IMDb and is rated 7.4. So that's respectable, but like I said, it still is absolutely underrated, and I think way more people should know about and appreciate and just enjoy this really great British film from the 60s. I don't want to spoil really anything about this movie, but I think I can still give some context about why this is a cool movie, and maybe set expectations a little bit if you're thinking you should watch this movie. So this is a review that you can watch and maybe will really help before you see the movie. I think a lot of British movies from a similar time period, sort of the 50s and 60s, have kind of a thick national veneer on them. So you look at a movie like Cast a Dark Shadow or The Servant, or the Browning version, or just sort of some of these kind of classic British films. I really like all three of those movies, I'll say. I really like Dirk Bogarde in the first two. But all of them have kind of this like Britishness to them that's almost overpowering in some sense. And I think really what I'm trying to get at here is that they're very theatrical. A lot of them have their roots in the theater, so this sort of very dramatic theatrical acting and whatnot. And like I said, I really like Dirk Bogarde, but perhaps guilty of this at times, which is in itself not bad, but it is slightly unnatural maybe, or it makes it slightly hard to connect, right? There was a certain grammar of that film, or a certain sort of style of it that is kind of distant now. It's quite a bit different from how modern movies are done, and I think it makes it somewhat hard maybe to identify with this movie sometimes. This movie is totally different. So at the beginning, you sort of think you're going to be watching something similar in the first 2 minutes of the movie. Sort of sets it up to think, this is sort of a classic British film here. Where here we got London, and we've got this little sort of tenement house thing, and we've got the landlady and such. But as it goes on, you realize that this movie is totally, it's from a different generation completely, as in it is a movie by the youth, it seems like. Although I actually don't know how old Brian Forbes was or anything like that, but it certainly seems like a new bunch of filmmakers, a new set of ideas and themes and styles. And it also, rather than being characterized by sort of rigid theatrical acting, it is an incredibly naturalistic movie, and a really triumph of humanist cinema, I think. So really, really nice movie. What is it? What's it about? Well, this movie is set almost entirely inside sort of one apartment, and a lot of it's set in one room of one apartment, which, as you may be able to guess, is L-shaped. It stars this young French woman, 27-year-old French woman named Jane, who comes to find lodging from a sort of interesting landlady named Doris, who owns this building, and it follows her relationships that she builds with the other people in the building, and one very interesting decision she's making. So this is not a spoiler because this is the beginning of the movie, but it turns out that Jane is pregnant, and she goes in the beginning to a doctor. Really great scene with her and the doctor, and she is really on the fence, conflicted about whether or not she should keep the child. She's living alone. It's not clear what is up with the father, and it's not clear how she should proceed. It's not clear what she wants. It's not clear what makes the most sense, and it's not clear, as the movie builds, it's not clear how the other people in the house will react and how this will affect her relationship. So this pregnancy really looms over things that happen in the movie. And in particular, she starts developing a relationship for one of the other lodgers. Okay, that is all the information about the plot of the movie that I will be sharing. This movie has a slightly slow start, I will admit, and a slightly, and it is sort of a quirky movie in some subtle ways, and that especially comes out in the beginning. This is not your standard sort of screenwriting 101 screenplay where you have the very obvious exposition, then, we've got the rising action, things like that. This functions in a different way, and in the beginning, that's a little bit odd. There's some tension created by the fact that, so like I said, the overhanging present, let's see, that's the main dramatic thrust of the movie. There's also sort of a little bit of a tension because Jane is not British. That's sort of another dramatic piece of it, but neither of these really manifest themselves as like clear-cut conflicts that cause really, that really come to a head, at least not in the beginning. Instead, drama sort of comes at sort of quirky times and whatnot. It's a little bit hard to predict exactly who's going to react in certain ways, especially this Doris character, who's the landlady. It's kind of an odd character who becomes sort of up in arms about some things, but is very accepting of other things and things like that, right? So in the beginning of the movie, Doris herself basically is the dramatic engine of the plot and this visit to the doctor. Doris is sort of the dramatic engine of the plot, and it's a little bit sort of serendipitous, or it's a little bit unclear how that functions, right? How she's going to react to certain things, which is totally different from a more traditional movie where the drama of the plot might be like, let's say that the characters make a bet about something in the beginning, and then, okay, we have this sort of lever. We've got this sort of dramatic pivot of the movie, which is the bet or something like that, right? Or there's some event. Well, the beginning of the movie doesn't really have that, and instead it's sort of this sort of odd exchange of conversations with various characters and then people reacting in certain ways. And that might just seem like a totally vague description, but maybe vague is the right word, actually. And then the beginning, the plot is a little bit vague. It's not totally clear where things are going, but just have a little bit of patience. These early scenes are not bad, but they are, like I said, maybe a little bit vague. It's not long before you realize, whoa, this is a great scene I'm watching here. My first realization of that was when Jane and her potential romantic interest are in the park. That's all I'll say. That scene is phenomenal. I mean, you will be hard-pressed to find, like, that could stand as a scene in any great movie, pretty much anywhere. Incredibly just interesting, clever script, really great naturalistic acting. I should say, the Leslie Caron, who plays Jane, or Karen, or I think she's French, so Caron, relatively famous actress, sort of. Not the kind of actress who would have been famous in the 60s, but who nobody will have known who that is now, unless you really like that era. But she does an incredible job. I'd never heard of any of the other people in the movie, but incredible. They do an incredible job with natural performances. The script, ridiculously strong. And like I said, once you get to that part of the movie with the park scene, you realize, wow, that's a really strong scene. It's followed up by another really strong scene and another one until the movie ends, basically. And throughout, you have really thoughtful, really interesting, non-contrived drama. So, like I said, the plot in the beginning is maybe a little bit vague. There is still, throughout the movie, a slight... Like I said, it's sort of an unconventional movie in some ways, and I think the main reason why it's unconventional, and maybe the main reason why some people are a little bit put off by it, and why it's not just like a 10 out of 10 for everyone, and why this isn't a super famous movie, is because that vagueness continues a little bit, just in that it's not always totally predictable what's going to happen, and how people are going to react, and what's going to matter and what's not going to matter, and what the movie's going to be about, and the plot. I mean, I almost was wondering, like, 2/3 of the way through the movie, what the movie was really about in some ways. But I actually found that really interesting because it's unpredictable and it's sort of fun. But it's not unpredictable for the reason that a lot of movies are unpredictable, as in you don't know who's going to win the bet. But it's unpredictable just in, like, what is going to occur next? Like, who's going to walk in? What are they going to say? How are they going to take this? That said, the dramatic engine of the film, which is this looming pregnancy, is powerful and is handled well, and the intellectual, moral, but also the personal questions involving the relationship she's forming, and that they do a great job of ratcheting up the tension as that goes along. That said, this is not a morality play. This is not something like Judgment at Nuremberg or something where the whole movie is really centered around some moral question. It's a much lighter touch when it comes to this sort of moral question about should she have the child or not. And they examine this question not really directly, but they do give a number of chances for her to talk to different characters and sort of not explicitly ask anyone or not explicitly talk to anyone about it, really, but get some insight into things. So, for instance, there's a prostitute who lives in the basement, right? And when you hear about her work and her life, that is inherently sort of a conversation about the pregnancy, but it's not explicitly stated. I really like that sort of subtlety to it. Like I said, it's a far cry from something like Judgment at Nuremberg, which came out really around the same time. And that is what is sort of early 60s, what a lot of these movies would be serious social dramas. And this is a serious social drama, but it's totally different from most serious social dramas that have a central moral issue and then like very explicitly addressing that all the time. The pregnancy is not talked about much in the movie, and Jane is conflicted about it, which is the case in these other movies too. But the difference is that she won't tell you that she's conflicted so much as she's just sort of doesn't really talk about it and doesn't really, sort of hard to read how she's feeling about it, which is another strength of the movie, I think, is the subtlety with which her thought process about it occurs, right? In general, one of the main virtues of this movie is subtlety, right? The subtlety of all the different relationships, the subtle acting, but also the subtlety with which they take this central moral concept, which, like I said, huge diversion from classic films, which would have used this as like the linchpin of the drama, is she going to have the baby? Is she not, right? This movie is ostensibly about that, but very different sort of route into that problem. So, like I said, I don't want to really spoil much of the plot. So there's not a whole lot left to say about the movie. In fact, the other reason why I think this movie just barely sneaks into this series is because in some ways you might not even need a guide to watch it. I think this is actually a movie that almost anyone can just sit down, have a little bit of patience, like I said, slightly slow start, slightly unconventional dramatic structure, maybe more subtle at times than some people are expecting. But this is a really great movie with great scenes that is dramatic. It is compelling. It's interesting to watch, unpredictable, with really strong characters and an interesting story that is just sort of delightfully unconventional from the start to the finish. So not only does it eschew sort of the very traditional or the British acting and also sort of the classic cinema, but it also has genuinely innovative cinematography and just sort of interesting, unconventional things throughout, which includes the ending, which is pretty cool. But it's not in your face like something like Steppenwolf that I discussed recently, which is a hugely over the top, really sort of in your face thing. This is a subtle but unconventional, interesting movie from a newer generation. It does also embrace jazz, though. The one final thing I will point out about it is that I say this is a movie of a younger generation that's a pretty progressive movie, pretty interesting movie in a lot of ways. There is a slight... I don't know exactly how to put it. There is a slight indecisiveness, moral indecisiveness on the part of the movie when it comes, a slight indecisiveness of the movie when it comes to certain moral issues. As in, there's a lot of times where it seems like sort of a very progressive and forward-thinking movie. There are also moments where they might be in a jazz club, for instance, and a character will sort of comment on couples that are like dancing intimately on the dance floor, as if to suggest that that is not something to be done, right? Where it does seem like it does seem to have a slightly more traditional view at times. Now, this is partly part of the clockwork of the movie because it's another factor for Jane to consider as she thinks about this child, as that would be a traditionally improper thing to do. Okay, if the people around her have the more traditional viewpoint, then that is another thing to think about. But there also is just a little bit of a sense that the movie itself is a little bit confused, I think, about what exactly is proper, sort of. But this does not sink the ship by any means, because if anything, kind of the point of the movie is that this is a tough decision in changing times where norms and traditions are shifting. And I guess what I'm trying to say is if you're hoping that by the end of the movie you will know exactly what's right, or you'll know what the director thinks is right and what the script thinks was the right decision and the right way forward, well, you're not going to learn that. But it is a delightfully subtle movie that takes on this issue in an incredibly empathetic way, and in a way that I think is really uncommon for a movie from any time, but particularly from a movie from 1962. This movie is light years ahead of its time. Really great movie that I strongly recommend that you watch. So The L-Shaped Room from 1962, directed by Brian Forbes, starring mainly Leslie Carl and some other great actors that I don't really know who they are, but maybe they have done stuff, is a movie that's totally worth your time and that you should check out. And I think, to be honest, this might be the strongest recommendation that I'll be giving for any movie throughout this series, which looks at sort of offbeat, lesser-known movies. I think this likely is going to be the best movie that I will see out of all of these. It's really terrific, and you should check it out if you get a sense. And like I said, there's a 4K remaster of this, so you actually can find this movie to watch it. It is floating around on the internet and in physical form in person through underground channels and above ground channels. So you should be able to track this down one way or another and watch it, and I think you should.